What started as a normal subway ride for Jason Statham quickly turned into a moment that the whole world would soon be talking about. You won't believe what happened next and how it changed everything. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Jason Statham sat quietly on a worn-down plastic seat, his baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a plain hoodie disguising his famous features. The rumbling of the subway train echoed through the metal carriage, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that dulled the senses of the tired passengers around him. His eyes scanned the crowd with subtle, practiced precision. No cameras, no flashing lights, no fans rushing to ask for autographs. For the first time in months, he was just another commuter. He savored the feeling of being invisible. The subway car smelled of metal, old leather, and the faint traces of fast food someone had discarded under the seat. Jason leaned back, his eyes half closed, letting the hum of the moving train wash over him. He hadn't felt this free in a long time. No directors shouting orders, no press tours, no flashing cameras capturing every glance, every mistake. Just him, a man in a crowd. But that momentary peace didn't last. At the next station, the car jolted to a stop, and a group of new passengers poured in. Among them was a young man wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up tight over his head. His sharp eyes darted left and right, scanning the crowd. Jason noticed him immediately. He'd seen this kind of energy before. Restless, twitchy, looking for something or someone to provoke. The young man's eyes locked on a target. A black, elderly woman, likely in her late 60s or early 70s, slowly pushed her way inside, clutching a large, overstuffed handbag against her chest. Her movements were slow, careful. Her worn-out shoes shuffled across the floor as she tried to find a seat. No one moved to offer her one. Jason felt a twinge of irritation at the sight. She glanced around hopefully, her eyes landing on several seated passengers, but no one looked up. Her face twisted in quiet disappointment. Jason watched her from under his cap, his jaw tightening. He thought about getting up to offer his seat, but before he could move, the young man in the hoodie stepped forward. At first, Jason thought he was going to help her. But then, it happened. "Move it, Grandma," the young man sneered, his voice sharp and venomous. He blocked her path, forcing her to stop mid-step. Her eyes widened in surprise. She glanced at him, confused, then lowered her head, trying to move around him, but he stepped in front of her again. "I said, move," he barked, shoving her lightly with his shoulder. The old woman stumbled back, gripping the metal pole for support. Gasps echoed from a few nearby passengers. Jason's fingers twitched, his instincts telling him to stand. But he didn't. Not yet. He watched, his eyes narrowing, his heart beating a little faster. The young man chuckled, looking around as if expecting applause. A couple of passengers grinned. A man sitting across from Jason smirked and shook his head in amusement. Others watched but quickly lowered their gazes, not wanting to get involved. "Look at this old bag," the young man said loudly, turning to the crowd as if he were a comedian on stage. "Dragging her whole house around in this ugly bag. What you got in there, Grandma? Rocks." The few people who laughed did so nervously. Some pulled out their phones and started recording. Jason's fingers clenched into fists under his hoodie. He could feel his pulse in his ears. The old woman didn't say anything. She clutched her bag tighter, trying to walk past him, her eyes fixed on the floor. But the young man wasn't done. He stepped in front of her again, his grin widening. "Where you think you're going, huh?" he sneered, blocking her path. "You deaf, Grandma? I'm talking to you." He shoved her harder this time and she stumbled into the pole. Her handbag slipped from her grip and dropped to the floor with a loud thud. Jason shot up from his seat without even realizing it, but he stopped himself halfway. He sat back down slowly, his eyes locked on the scene, heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to see if anyone would step up. Surely someone would. There were at least 20 people in this subway car. Young men, adults, even women. Someone had to step up. Someone had to say something. No one moved. The old woman bent down to pick up her bag, her hands trembling as she tried to lift it. The young man leaned down at the same time, yanked it from her fingers, and held it high in the air. Her face crumpled in shock and disbelief. "Give that back," she cried, her voice cracking. "That's mine, please, give it back." "Oh, now you got something to say, huh?" He smirked, shaking the bag in front of her like a toy. "Too late, Grandma. Should have said something sooner." She reached for it, but he yanked it away, laughing. The few passengers who were recording kept their phones up, their faces blank. Some chuckled. Others acted as if nothing was happening. A man in a suit opened his newspaper wider, hiding his face behind it. Jason's jaw tightened so hard it hurt. Every part of him was screaming to move, to act, but he still sat. For a moment, he felt disgusted. Not with the young man, not with the passengers, with himself, for waiting, for testing these people, thinking someone would do the right thing. They wouldn't. He stood up. This time, he didn't sit back down. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved toward the young man. No one noticed him at first, too focused on the spectacle. The young man swung the handbag playfully, like it was a prize he'd just won. The old woman reached for it again, but he shoved her away with his free hand. Jason's eyes darkened. "That's enough," Jason said, his voice low but sharp as a knife. The young man spun around, eyes narrowing at him. "What you say, old man?" He tilted his head, sizing him up. "Who you think you are?" Jason pulled back his hoodie just enough for his face to be seen. The young man's grin faltered. "Give it back," Jason said, his voice deadly calm. Silence fell over the car. The mood shifted. People lowered their phones, faces filled with recognition. "Nah, you ain't serious," the young man muttered, still trying to hold on to his fake bravado. "I don't care who you are, bro. You ain't special." "Last chance," Jason said, taking a step forward. His eyes were cold, sharp as broken glass. "Put it down." The young man hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers, but no one backed him up. Even the man with the smirk looked away. All right," the young man said, raising his hands as if surrendering. "Chill, man. It's just a joke." He crouched down, placing the bag on the ground. "Here, take it. Sheesh." "Apologize," Jason ordered, not moving an inch. The young man frowned. "Man, come on, I just..." "Apologize," Jason repeated, his voice hard as stone. The young man swallowed, his face twisted in frustration. Slowly, he turned to the old woman. "Sorry," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "Louder," Jason snapped. "I said, I'm sorry, all right?" The young man barked, throwing his hands up. Jason stepped forward, eyes locked on his. "Now get on the ground." The young man's face went pale. He hesitated, looking for a way out, but Jason's stare didn't break. Slowly, he lowered himself to the ground, face down, hands behind his head. Jason stood over him, his breathing steady, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. A woman near the back of the car whispered, "Is that Jason Statham?" "Call the police," Jason said to the crowd. No one moved. "Call them. Jason repeated, his voice sharper than before. This time, several people reached for their phones. The old woman sat down, clutching her bag tightly, tears welling up in her eyes. She looked at Jason, her lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Jason didn't say anything. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the young man on the floor, ensuring he wouldn't move. The subway door slammed shut with a metallic clang, sealing off the outside world. The train jerked forward, and the rumble of its movement echoed through the narrow metal chamber. Jason Statham stood firm, his eyes locked on the young man lying face down on the cold, dirty floor of the subway car. His breathing was slow and steady, every muscle in his body poised like a coiled spring, ready for any sudden movement from the man below him. The old woman sat a few feet away, gripping her bag as if it were a lifeline, her eyes fixed on Jason with quiet gratitude. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. The mood in the train had shifted entirely. The same people who had laughed at the young man's antics now sat in stunned silence. Some lowered their phones, others glanced around nervously, as if unsure where to look. It was as if Jason had broken some kind of unspoken agreement. The one where everyone agrees to mind their own business no matter what. A sharp, clattering noise came from the far end of the car. One of the passengers had accidentally dropped their phone, and the sound made everyone flinch. Jason didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the young man. No sudden movements, no signs of defiance. The young man's breathing was shallow. His head turned just enough to see Jason from the corner of his eye. His cocky smirk had vanished, replaced by fear. "Don't even think about it," Jason said quietly, his voice low but sharp as a razor. "I ain't moving, man," the young man replied, his voice muffled by the dirty floor beneath his face. His breathing was quick and uneven now. "I ain't moving, I swear." "Good," Jason replied, his tone colder than steel. A woman sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted between Jason, the young man, and the old woman. She glanced at her phone like she was considering calling someone, but instead, she shoved it into her purse and stared at the window, as if it might somehow save her from the tension. "Did someone call the police yet?" Jason asked, his eyes scanning the car. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Jason raised his voice. I said, "Did anyone call the police?" A man in a suit at the far end of the car cleared his throat, still tapping on his phone. Yeah, I called," he muttered without making eye contact. "They said they're on the way." Jason gave him a single nod, then turned his attention back to the young man. "You hear that? They're on their way. You better think real hard about what you're gonna say when they get here." "I ain't doing nothing, man," the young man muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "She dropped her bag, that's all. Y'all overreactin'." Jason crouched slowly, his movements calculated, controlled. He lowered himself until he was at eye level with the young man, his piercing gaze unrelenting. "Don't lie to me," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw everything. Everyone here saw everything. The only thing you should be thinking about now is how you're gonna make this right." The young man didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the crowd, scanning for sympathy, but there was none. Everyone avoided his gaze now, acting like they hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything. The same people who had laughed at the old woman now stared at the floor, their phones, or the windows, anywhere but at him. Jason stayed crouched for a moment longer, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood back up, never taking his eyes off the young man. The silence in the car grew heavier. The rumbling of the train on the tracks was the only sound, but even that felt distant. Minutes passed. Each second felt like an hour. Jason's eyes stayed locked on his target, unblinking, unwavering. He didn't need to do anything more. His presence alone was enough to keep everyone in line. Then, finally, the intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, Grandview Station. Please stand clear of the doors." Jason glanced at the old woman. Her eyes met his for the first time since it all began. There was a quiet understanding between them, something that didn't need words. She wiped at her eyes with a tissue, her hands still trembling. Jason gave her a short nod, and for the first time, she smiled. It was faint, but it was there. The train slowed, the squeal of the brakes filling the air. The young man on the floor stiffened, his breathing growing more erratic. His eyes darted to the door, calculating. Jason knew exactly what he was thinking. "Don't," Jason said sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You try it, and I promise you'll regret it." The young man froze like a deer caught in headlights. His hands twitched, but he didn't move. The train came to a full stop, the doors hissing open. A few passengers glanced toward the exit as if they were debating whether to leave or stay. Two people got up and stepped off, their eyes locked forward, avoiding Jason and the scene behind them. "Stay seated," Jason said calmly but firmly. His eyes flicked to the few passengers who looked like they were about to leave. "Everyone stays right where they are." One man hesitated, then slowly sat back down. The other pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll, but Jason could see his fingers were shaking. Suddenly, the distant sound of police sirens echoed from outside the subway tunnel. They grew louder as the train sat idle at the station. The young man's breathing grew frantic. His fingers twitched like he was weighing his options, his muscles tensing. "Don't do it," Jason warned again, his tone like a growl from a predator that's done playing with its prey. Another minute passed, then the train doors closed with a soft hiss. The train jolted forward, heading toward the next station. Jason glanced at the old woman. She clutched her bag even tighter now, her eyes locked on him with quiet determination. There was a fire there, a strength that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was something more now. The young man muttered something into the floor, his face twisted in frustration. Jason raised an eyebrow. "What's that? Speak up." "I said, this is stupid," the young man hissed. "You acting like you a cop or something." Jason chuckled under his breath. "I don't need a badge to know what's right and what's wrong." He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You do, though." The sirens grew louder and soon, flashing blue and red lights lit up the subway windows. The train began to slow as it neared the next stop. The tension in the car reached a boiling point. "Grand Central Station," the intercom announced. "Stand clear of the doors." Jason's eyes never left the young man. The car jolted as the train came to a stop. Passengers braced themselves. A second later, the doors hissed open. Silence. Then, heavy footsteps. 4 uniformed police officers entered, their faces sharp and focused. Their eyes scanned the car, instantly locking onto the man on the floor. The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" Jason didn't flinch. He nodded toward the young man on the ground. "This one tried to rob that woman," he said, pointing at the old woman who sat up a little straighter. "He shoved her, snatched her bag and tried to run. I stopped him." The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. "All right, on your feet," he barked at the young man. "Man, I didn't do nothing," the young man protested, but the officer grabbed him by the arm and yanked him to his feet. "I didn't do nothing." She dropped it. "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, twisting his arms behind his back. The metal clink of the cuffs echoed like a bell of finality. Jason watched as they pulled the young man off the train. Passengers exhaled in relief, some whispering among themselves. The old woman wiped away a tear, her eyes locked on Jason. "Thank you," she said softly. Jason gave her a small nod. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. The train doors closed. The rumble of the tracks returned. Jason sat back down, his heart steady, his eyes distant. The old woman smiled faintly at him once more before looking away. The subway rolled forward into the tunnel, and Jason closed his eyes, finally letting himself feel the weight of it all. The subway train moved through the underground tunnels with a steady, rhythmic clatter, but the air inside the car was anything but calm. Jason sat near the end of the carriage, his eyes fixed straight ahead, though his mind was still locked on everything that had just happened. The old woman sat across from him, her eyes distant but her hands still gripping her bag like it might be stolen again at any second. Her fingers twitched every so often, a sign that the fear hadn't fully left her body. The mood in the car had shifted from tense silence to something more uncomfortable: shame. None of the passengers made eye contact with each other. Their gazes were either on their phones or glued to the window, watching the dark subway walls zip past like a film reel no one wanted to see. A few of them had been bold earlier, cheering on the young man, laughing at the old woman. But now, none of them had anything to say. Their faces were pale, their eyes downcast. Jason noticed every bit of it. The police officers had left with the young man in cuffs at the last stop, but the weight of their presence still hung in the air. Jason glanced over at the old woman. She hadn't said a word since she thanked him. Her eyes darted around, like she was waiting for something else to go wrong. He knew that feeling. The feeling that trouble was never really gone. "Are you all right?" Jason asked, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the noise of the train. The old woman blinked, looking up as if she'd been pulled from a deep thought. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't look afraid. "I'm fine, baby," she said with a weak smile, her voice soft but steady. "I've been through worse." She adjusted her bag on her lap, patting it like it was a child that needed comfort. "But I appreciate you for what you did back there. Most folks would have just watched." Jason nodded, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the car at the passengers, still pretending they didn't hear anything. "Yeah, I noticed," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "People are real brave until it's time to be." The old woman chuckled, a short, dry laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ain't that the truth?" she replied. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as if she were trying to figure something out. She tilted her head, squinting slightly. "You look familiar. I seen you before." Jason leaned back and pulled the brim of his cap lower over his face. "Just got one of those faces," he said casually, looking away. She chuckled again, shaking her head. If you say so." Minutes passed in relative quiet. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the space, broken only by the robotic announcement of the next station. A man near the front of the car glanced at Jason, his eyes squinting like he was trying to connect the dots. Jason ignored him, keeping his eyes forward. The man reached for his phone, swiped a few times, then glanced at Jason again. His eyes widened. "Yo," the man muttered under his breath, his gaze darting between Jason and his phone. His lips parted, and Jason could see what was coming. The man's eyes locked on Jason, his face lit up with realization. He leaned forward, his eyes practically glowing with excitement. Yo, wait a second. Is that Jason Statham? He said just loud enough for the other passengers to hear. Heads turned. Whispers followed. People leaned forward, their eyes wide, their hands slowly reaching for their phones. The same people who'd sat in silence moments ago were now buzzing with energy, like bees in a broken hive. Is that really him? A teenage girl whispered to her friend, pointing toward Jason with her phone halfway up. Holy, that's Jason Statham. Another man mumbled as he lowered his headphones and squinted for a better look. Jason sighed, his face hardening. He'd been in this situation more times than he could count. It always started the same way. A quiet whisper, then the glances, then the phones, then the pictures. And once it started, it didn't stop. His peace, gone in an instant. He glanced at the man who'd started it, giving him a cold, sharp look that stopped him mid-sentence. The man froze, his grin faltering as he realized he'd just made a mistake. Jason didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. Don't. But it was too late. Yo, Jason man, can I get a pic? The man asked, raising his phone like he was already taking it. A few others did the same. Their phones up, camera apps open, fingers hovering over the record button. Come on, man, just one photo, bro. Jason shook his head slowly, his eyes cutting through the man like a blade. Not today, he said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The man slowly lowered his phone like a child being scolded. One of the teenage girls wasn't as easily deterred. She snapped a picture anyway, the soft click of her phone's camera loud enough to make Jason's eyes snap toward her. She gasped and quickly lowered her phone, blushing bright red. The old woman watched the whole scene with a bemused smile on her face. She leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with recognition. I knew it, she said softly, her grin growing wider. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before. She sat back, nodding to herself, like she'd solved a puzzle that had been bothering her all day. Jason Statham, huh? Well, I'll be. Jason glanced at her, and for the first time since he got on the train, he smiled. Don't blow my cover, he said quietly, tapping the brim of his cap. Your secret's safe with me, baby, she replied with a wink. The intercom crackled. Next stop, Midway Junction. Doors will open on the right. The train began to slow, the weight of it pushing everyone slightly forward in their seats. A few passengers gathered their bags, ready to get off. Jason kept his eyes on the floor, letting the moment pass. But he knew better. The whispers didn't stop. The stares didn't stop. And now, the cameras wouldn't stop. A man near the back of the car whispered, Yo, I'm putting this on TikTok. Jason closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Of course. Of course they would. It didn't matter what he'd just done. It didn't matter that he'd stood up for a woman who needed help. To them, it was a moment to record, a video to post for likes and views. The train screeched to a halt, the door sliding open with a soft hiss. A few people got off, but one man stayed behind just long enough to snap a picture of Jason before hopping out. Jason watched him go, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. The old woman watched him for a moment, then leaned forward, her voice soft but full of wisdom. Don't mind them, baby, she said. They only see the flash, not the fight. Jason glanced at her, his brow furrowed. She smiled, tilting her head toward him like a grandmother sharing a secret. You did the right thing, she said firmly. Doesn't matter who sees it. The train doors slid closed. Jason sat in silence, her words sinking in. For a moment, he felt lighter. Then, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, glancing at the screen. A notification popped up from social media. "You're trending, bro. Jason Statham stops robbery in subway." He stared at the notification for a moment. Then came another. "Statham stops subway attack, hero in real life too." Another. "Video of Jason Statham handling thug on subway goes viral. Watch here." Jason turned off the screen, slid the phone back into his pocket, and leaned back in his seat. He glanced at the old woman one last time. She was looking out the window now, her bag safe in her lap, her hands steady once again. The train rattled on, deeper into the tunnel, and Jason closed his eyes. No cameras, no flashes, no noise. Just the steady hum of the subway tracks beneath him. But he knew it was already too late. Somewhere out there, his face was on a screen. Somewhere, someone was sharing it. And the world would be watching by the time he reached his stop. The subway car rattled forward, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead with every jolt of the train. Jason sat with his arms crossed, his eyes closed, but his mind was far from at peace. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than any role he'd ever played. He knew it was only a matter of time before his phone would start buzzing with calls, texts, and notifications. Fame was a double-edged sword, and he had just sharpened it. The old woman sat quietly across from him, her eyes locked on her bag. She had stopped shaking. Her fingers ran slowly over the fabric of the bag, tracing its seams as if grounding herself back into reality. Every so often, she glanced at Jason. It wasn't a look of awe or curiosity. It was something deeper. Respect, maybe. Gratitude. At the far end of the car, two teenage boys were huddled together, whispering while glancing at their phones. One of them snickered, tilting the screen so his friend could see. Jason didn't need to guess. He knew what was on the screen. His face, his name, the video. His phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. He pulled it out slowly, dreading what he would see. Sure enough, there it was. Messages from his agent, his publicist, and 3 other people he hadn't spoken to in weeks. "Jason, call me ASAP. You're blowing up online, we need to get ahead of this." "Dude, you're a legend for that. Everyone's talking about it." Jason turned off the phone and shoved it back into his pocket. He wasn't ready for that yet. Not now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, letting out a long breath through his nose. The weight on his shoulders didn't feel any lighter. If anything, it felt heavier. The subway announcer crackled through the intercom. "Next stop, Sycamore Station. Doors will open on the right." A woman near the middle of the car stood up, adjusting her coat and grabbing her purse. She glanced at Jason, her eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. She didn't say anything, but she knew. They all knew. Recognition was like a chain reaction. One person points, then another, and before long, the whole world knows who you are. "Is that him?" one of the teenage boys whispered to his friend. His phone held low, but his eyes darting toward Jason. "I swear, that's him, bro. That's Statham." His friend glanced over, his eyes widening. "No way," he muttered, his hand already reaching for his phone. Jason saw it out of the corner of his eye. His patience was running thin, but he kept his cool. He leaned back against the seat, tilting his cap lower to cover more of his face. It wouldn't help. It never did. The subway slowed with a loud screech, metal grinding against metal as the train pulled into Sycamore Station. The doors slid open, letting in a rush of cool air. A few passengers shuffled out, exchanging quick glances at Jason on their way past him. A man in a gray hoodie paused at the door, staring at him like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Jason felt his eyes on him, felt the stare dig into his side. "Yeah, that's him," the man muttered, pulling out his phone. Jason's jaw tightened. The old woman noticed. She sat forward, glancing at the man at the door, her eyes sharp and knowing. She didn't say a word, but her eyes did. The man hesitated. He looked at her, looked at Jason. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he put his phone away. He stepped off the train just as the doors hissed shut behind him. Jason glanced at the old woman. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. The train lurched forward again, sending a ripple through the passengers as they braced themselves. The ride continued in tense quiet. Nobody laughed now. Nobody recorded. But Jason knew it wouldn't last. Minutes passed. His phone buzzed again. This time he didn't check it. He knew what it was. He could already hear the headlines in his mind. Jason Statham stops robbery in subway. Or, Statham goes full action hero in real life. The media loved stories like this. They'd twist it into something bigger than it was. Turn him into something bigger than he was. He wasn't a hero. He'd done what anyone should have done. But he knew that didn't matter. Across from him, the old woman cleared her throat softly. "They're gonna turn you into a story, baby," she said, her voice calm but certain. "They always do." Jason glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "They will." "Don't let 'em change the ending," she added, her eyes steady on his. "It's still your story." Her words hit harder than he expected. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, letting them sink in. His story. His ending. The train rolled forward, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The teenage boys were still staring, still whispering, but they didn't approach. Jason didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He already knew they were taking pictures, sending them to their friends, uploading them online. By the time he stepped off this train, half the world would know. He glanced at the old woman one more time. Her eyes were closed now, her head tilted back, her breathing slow and steady. She was resting, finally. After everything, she could rest. Jason watched her for a moment, a quiet calm settling in his chest. His phone buzzed again. His patience snapped. He yanked it out of his pocket, ready to turn it off for good. But then, he saw the message at the top of the screen. It wasn't from his agent, his publicist, or some random news alert. It was a text from his sister. "Proud of you, Jay. You did the right thing." Jason stared at it. Just those words. Simple, clean, real. He felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with stress or frustration. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees again. For the first time since the whole thing started, he let himself breathe. The intercom crackled. "Next stop, Southgate Station. Doors will open on the right." Jason sat up straighter. This was his stop. He glanced at the old woman. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing even. He didn't want to wake her. She'd been through enough. As the train slowed, Jason stood up, his hands in his pockets. The old woman stirred slightly, one eye opening. She smiled at him, soft and slow, like she knew something he didn't. "Take care, baby," she said softly. "You too," Jason replied, his voice low but certain. "Stay safe." The train came to a stop. The doors slid open, and a rush of cool air filled the car. Jason stepped toward the door, his eyes scanning the platform. No cameras, no crowds. Just people. Regular people, too caught up in their own lives to notice him. He stepped out, walking with purpose, his head low, his steps steady. Behind him, The train doors hissed shut. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. As he walked down the platform, his phone buzzed again, then again, and again. His agent, his publicist, the news alerts, the messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. All of them wanting a piece of the story. His story. He kept walking, kept his head down, kept his steps steady. The world could watch if it wanted to. Let them watch. Because for the first time in a long time, Jason wasn't playing a role. This time he was just a man doing the right thing. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long, golden rays across the streets below. Cars honked in the distance, and the hum of urban life filled the air. Jason Statham stood at the window of his apartment, one hand on the windowsill, the other holding his phone. He had been standing there for the past 20 minutes, just staring at the screen, watching the messages pour in one after another. Notifications stacked up like falling dominoes. His inbox was overflowing with texts, missed calls, and social media mentions. His face remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped against the edge of the phone, slow and deliberate. Jason, the video has 2 million views already. Call me. We need to get ahead of this, Jason. The media is all over it. Man, you're a hero for real. People love you for this. He scrolled through the messages, his eyes narrowing. Most of them were from his agent, his manager, and random people he hadn't spoken to in years. The rest were news alerts from every major outlet. He knew exactly what they were saying. They were turning him into a headline. Jason Statham stops racist attack on elderly woman in subway. Real-life action hero. Statham takes down thug on NYC train. Hollywood star becomes symbol of anti-racism in viral video. Jason rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a slow, heavy sigh. They weren't even telling the story right. They never did. It wasn't about him. It wasn't supposed to be about him. It was supposed to be about the woman. It was supposed to be about how no one helped her until it was too late. But that wasn't a story people wanted to hear. No, they wanted a hero. They wanted Jason Statham, the action star, to swoop in and save the day like it was one of his movies. He tossed the phone on the table and sat down on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The weight of it all sat on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He didn't ask for any of this. He didn't want it. His whole goal that day was to be invisible, just another guy on the subway. But now, the world was watching. A knock echoed through the apartment, sharp and loud. Jason turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing toward the door. Another knock, this time more urgent. "Jason, it's me, Derek." A familiar voice called from the other side. "Open up, man, I know you're in there." Jason hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked toward the door. He unlocked it, pulled it open, and was met with the familiar face of Derek, his longtime friend and sometimes bodyguard. Derek stepped inside quickly, looking around like they were being followed. He had his phone in his hand, his face tight with concern. "Man, you're all over the news," Derek said, shaking his head as he glanced around the room. "It's everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. You're viral, bro." "I know," Jason muttered, walking back to the couch. He sat down, rubbing his temples. "Don't need to see it to know. My phone won't stop buzzing." Derek sat next to him, still scrolling on his phone. His eyes flicked up at Jason, his expression more serious now. "They're calling you a hero, Jay. People love you for this. They're saying you stood up when nobody else did. You know how rare that is." Jason let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, they weren't on that train. They didn't see how long it took for someone to do something." He shook his head, his eyes distant. Half of them were recording, the other half were laughing. Nobody moved till it was almost too late. "Doesn't matter now," Derek said firmly, putting his phone down. "What matters is they saw you do it. That's all people care about." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jason. "They're talking about interviews, man. Late night shows, morning news, all of it. Everyone wants you to tell the story. You gotta control the narrative before they do it for you." Jason leaned back, resting his head against the cushion. His eyes focused on the ceiling, his jaw tightening. "No?" Derek frowned. "No? What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no," Jason repeated, turning his head toward him. "I'm not doing interviews. I'm not sitting on TV telling people how brave I was. I'm not interested." "Come on, man," Derek said, leaning forward. "You know how this works. If you stay quiet, they're just gonna fill in the blanks for you. They'll twist it, make it about something it's not. They'll turn it into another hero saves the day story, and you'll have no control over it." Jason stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's exactly what they'll do." "So what's the plan?" Derek asked, his eyebrows raised. "You just gonna let it ride?" Jason sat up straight, leaning his forearms on his knees. He thought about the old woman on the subway. Her eyes, her voice, the way she clutched her bag like it was the last thing in the world she had left. Her words echoed in his mind. "Don't let him change the ending." He nodded to himself, his eyes sharp with new focus. "No," he said, standing up. "I'm going to tell it myself." Derek's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Oh, yeah? How you gonna do that?" Jason grabbed his phone off the table, unlocked it, and opened the camera app. He sat on the edge of the couch, holding the phone up so his face filled the frame. No lights, no fancy angles. Just him, raw and unfiltered. Derek leaned back, crossing his arms, watching him with a small smirk. "All right," Jason muttered to himself, taking a breath. He hit the record button. He stared straight into the camera, his face calm but firm. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set like stone. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His voice was steady. "By now, you've probably seen the video," he began, his tone as sharp as a blade. "And I know what they're saying. They're calling me a hero, saying I did something special. But I'm here to tell you, that's not the story." He paused, letting his words sink in. His eyes didn't waver from the camera. "The story isn't about me. It's about the woman on that train. An elderly woman, minding her own business, getting harassed, shoved, and disrespected. And you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the guy doing it. It was the fact that nobody did anything. They watched, they laughed, they recorded it like it was entertainment." Jason leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's the real story. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. People saw something wrong, and they looked away. They pulled out their phones instead of their courage." He leaned even closer to the camera. "If you're watching this, I want you to ask yourself one thing. What would you have done? Would you have helped? Or would you have watched?" He sat back, his eyes still locked on the camera. "Don't call me a hero. I'm just a man who did what needed to be done. But next time it might be you sitting on that train. It might be you holding that phone. Ask yourself if you're gonna watch. Or if you're gonna do." Jason let the silence stretch for a few seconds before he nodded once and ended the recording. "Man," Derek said, his voice low with respect, "that's it. That's the one." Jason didn't say anything. He uploaded it. No hashtags, no captions, just raw truth. The phone buzzed less than a minute later. New comments, shares, messages. "This is what we need to hear." Finally, someone said it. "Nah, he's right. I'm ashamed of myself now." Jason put his phone face down on the table and sat back, his eyes distant but steady. This time it wouldn't be about him. This time the story would be different. He glanced at Derek, then at the window, where the city lights flickered like stars. "Sometimes," Jason muttered, his eyes locked on the glow of the skyline, "you gotta change the ending yourself." The next morning, Jason woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating loudly on the nightstand. It buzzed over and over, a non-stop hum like a relentless alarm clock. Sunlight leaked through the edges of the blackout curtains, casting streaks of gold across the room. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, still groggy from a night of restless sleep. His phone wouldn't stop. Call after call, notification after notification. He knew what it was before he even looked. Slowly, he reached for it, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the glow of the screen. 56 missed calls. Over 300 text messages. His inbox was flooded. Every social media app had dozens of alerts stacked on top of each other like falling bricks. His face was on every thumbnail, his name in every headline. He scrolled through the messages, each one coming in faster than he could read. "You're a legend for that video, Jason. Bro, you really did that. Respect. We need more people like you in this world. Can you come on our show this week? We'd love to have you talk about your experience." The headlines were everywhere. His own face, his own words, played on every news station, every social media feed, every video platform. Clips of his message were spliced together, captions added for effect. "Don't call me a hero. The story isn't about me. What would you have done?" Jason shook his head and let the phone drop onto the bed beside him. They weren't even listening. The story had become bigger than him. Bigger than the woman on that train. Now, it was a movement. People were sharing their own experiences in the comments. Some wrote about times they stayed quiet when they should have spoken up. Others shared stories of moments when they did step in, when they did the right thing. The tag, #Don'tWatchAct, was trending. It wasn't just a hashtag. It was a movement. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. For a moment, he sat in silence, his mind replaying everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. The subway, the old woman, the young man face down on the floor. The weight of it all was heavier now. It wasn't just a single moment. It had become something much bigger. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call from his sister. Jason sighed but answered it, holding the phone up to his face. His sister's face filled the screen, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. "Look at you, big bro, out here saving the world," she teased, leaning forward with an exaggerated smile. "You know, you broke the internet, right?" Jason rolled his eyes, leaning back on the headboard. "Don't start with me, Tasha. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Supposed to be like what?" she asked, cocking her head. "You stood up for that lady. People saw it. You inspired them. Ain't nothing wrong with that." "I didn't do it to inspire anybody," Jason muttered, running a hand over his face. "I did it 'cause nobody else would." Tasha's face softened. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know. But that's exactly why it's hitting so hard, Jay. You didn't have to do it, but you did. People see that, and it makes them think. Makes them wonder if they would have done the same." Jason didn't respond. He knew she was right. It's just that he hadn't asked for any of this. He'd wanted to stay in the shadows, stay invisible. But shadows don't exist when the world puts a spotlight on you. Anyway, Tasha continued, smirking now, I just called to tell you Mom saw it. She called me all choked up talking about how proud she is of you. She grinned wider, leaning closer to the camera. She said, tell Jason he finally did something worth talking about. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, that sounds like her. You good though? She asked, her eyes narrowing with concern. For real, Jay, all jokes aside, you good? He paused for a second, thinking about it. He glanced at the phone on the bed, still lighting up with new messages and notifications. The world was knocking on his door, but for once, he didn't feel like running. Yeah, he said quietly, nodding. I'm good. All right, Tasha said, flashing him one last grin. Stay solid, big bro. I'll call you later. Yeah, he replied, ending the call. Jason stared at the phone for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he stood up and walked to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, letting the cold drink calm his nerves. As he leaned against the counter, his mind drifted back to the old woman on the train. Her face, her eyes, how they had shifted from fear to gratitude. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from a news outlet. New developments in subway assault. Police release statement. Jason raised an eyebrow, tapped on the alert, and opened the article. The headline read, Suspect in subway incident faces multiple charges, including assault and robbery. He scrolled down. The article explained how, after reviewing footage from the subway's security cameras, the police had decided to press charges against the young man. Witness statements and video evidence confirmed everything Jason had described. It wasn't just his word anymore. The system had seen it too. Near the bottom of the article there was a quote from the old woman. Her name was listed as Dorothy Henderson, 72, retired nurse. Her words hit Jason harder than any news headline. I was scared. I thought nobody would help me. But then he did. He didn't do it for fame or attention. He did it 'cause it was right. People need to remember that. Sometimes you just have to do what's right. Jason stared at the screen for a long moment. He could feel something shift inside him. Something steady and unshakable. He placed the phone face down on the counter and looked at his reflection in the kitchen window. His face looked tired but sure. He walked back to the living room, sat on the couch, and picked up his phone again. No cameras, no scripts, no interviews. Just him. He opened the camera app and hit record. This time, there were no long speeches, no dramatic pauses. Just truth. His face filled the screen, calm but firm. By now, you've all seen the video, he said. His eyes didn't waver. And you've probably seen the headlines. They're calling me a hero again. I'm not. I'm just a man who saw something wrong and did something about it, that's all. He leaned forward. His eyes were sharp, piercing the camera like he was talking to every person watching. But this isn't about me. It never was. It's about her. Her name is Dorothy Henderson. She's 72 years old. She's a retired nurse. She's somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. She didn't deserve what happened to her. None of it. Jason's voice grew firmer, his jaw tight with purpose. This ain't about me. And it ain't about being a hero. It's about what you do when you see something wrong. Do you sit there and watch it happen? Or do you stand up? Do you do something? He let that question hang in the air for a few seconds. Then, with a small nod, he finished with one final sentence. Next time you see it, don't watch, do. He ended the recording and uploaded it. No captions, no hashtags, just truth. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Comments flooded in, people shared it with their own stories. Parents posted it for their kids to see. Schools played it during assemblies. The hashtag #Don'tWatchDo trended worldwide within an hour. Jason sat back on the couch, his eyes closed, his mind finally at ease. His phone buzzed non-stop. But this time, he didn't mind. This time he'd told the story the way it needed to be told, not about him, about her. He leaned his head back, the sound of the city outside drifting through the window. The world would always be loud, always be watching. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to run from it. He'd changed the ending. This time the story was his. And that's the end of this unforgettable story. But it doesn't stop here. It's a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing can change everything. If you were moved by this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support motivates us to create more powerful stories like this one. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We're always reading them.